Please rewind this cassette.
Misery is a 1990 film based off the hit novel by Stephen King. It was directed by Rob Reiner, who at this point had a background mostly in comedy. Now, I'm not saying that he didn't branch out occasionally. He did make Stand By Me, one of the greatest coming-of-age films of all time that has plenty of drama in it. But when you think of Rob Reiner at the time, you think Sure Thing, you think Spinal Tap, you think Princess Bride. You don't think psychological thriller. And he even said on the commentary track he didn't really know how to make a movie like this. He had to watch every Hitchcock film and study films within the genre to understand how to do the camera work for this thing. Misery essentially is about the relationship between the artist and his fans, which is still relevant today, perhaps even more relevant today with the internet. See, King was writing about himself. He was writing about, what if my most crazy, obsessive fan had power over me and decided what I could do, this pressure that I have to write stories like this, what they want, why people buy this stuff, when I'm talked about, and he can't really do what he wants to as an artist. He can't really express himself the way he wants to as a writer, and you'll see this in King's work. I've often said when you read the Richard Bachman novels that they actually seem like those are the ones he gives a shit, and that's not true for everything. I'm a fan of Pet Sematary and so on. But I always wonder with King, like, yeah, he feels this pressure to give people what they want. Rob Reiner talks about this on the commentary track. You know, at the end of the book, he actually publishes this book where Misery comes back, but in the movie, he doesn't. He actually just, leaves it with Annie. And Rob Reiner said it's because Stephen King, deserves to be able to do what he wants as an artist and not have that pressure from fans. The film stars James Caan as Paul Sheldon, who is a famous writer who wrote this famous Misery series, and he goes out to a cabin he stays out to write these books. And on his way back, he's in a car accident and then is nursed back to health by Annie, who's played by Kathy Bates. Now, at first, Annie just seems a little quirky, a little eccentric, and then slowly it starts to come across that this bitch is fucking crazy. And Kathy Bates gives a very daring performance. This is a performance that could be pitched completely wrong because it borderlines on comedic. James Caan is playing the straight guy here, and a lot of big actors were offered this role. Steve Martin was offered this role, Dustin Hoffman was offered this role, Bill Murray, Jeff Daniels, all sorts of big name actors, and they all turned it down for different reasons. James Caan's an actor that I really love because you never really can tell that he's acting. He's a very natural actor, and he didn't really have a stage background like Kathy Bates, so they sort of clashed in that way. She was more of like a lot of rehearsal, let's know our lines, let's know our beats, and he just kind of wanted to live in the moment, so Reiner had to find a balance between those two styles. But really, this was like Kathy Bates' first big movie. Nobody knew who she was, and she won an Oscar. And it's really hard to talk about this as just a horror film because that really limits what it actually is. I mean, it is a horror film. She is a villain. She even becomes a slasher, really. But at the same time, this film is really, like I said, it's about what an artist's responsibility is and what it is to be an artist and how that affects you. That affects you mentally and how you really do feel like you're locked down and trapped in a small room. It's also a brilliant use of space in filmmaking. Most of this film takes place in a single room. It's not like there's a bunch of locations or Reiner's cutting to a bunch of things. It's really tough as a filmmaker to make a small space exciting, where it has to be more about blocking and inserts and so on. It's very tough to direct that because you really have nothing to cut to, so you really have to make the momentum come from the performances. Reiner does this just masterfully. I mean, he's one of those directors. I don't know how he does this. Every single one of his movies, I'm like, how the hell did you make that movie? This is such a technically accomplished film. It doesn't hurt that it's shot by Barry Sonnenfeld, who worked with the Coen brothers and then went on to become a very prolific and famous filmmaker in his own right. His camera work is brilliant. But really what makes this movie linger is just the fear that it induces with very little. There's very little actually, there's actually very little going on, but it's just, that something could happen. You're scared for Paul because of just how out of control Annie seems. She has a pig that she names Misery. She's overtly religious. She doesn't like swear words. She's very offended that he wrote a book with swear words in it. She makes him burn the book at one point. This is like killing your child. your art is your kid. So she's like, burn your kid in front of me. And that she even knows that he only writes one draft because he's superstitious about it. So she fucks with him. It's like that your fans know you so well they can fuck with you. Then, of course, we have Richard Farnsworth as Buster, the sheriff of the town, who really is a key to this film because he has to, slowly come around. Although there's this running thing with Stephen King movies like this, with The Shining, where there's a character who comes in to save the day, who's the only person who can come in and save our characters, and then they just die immediately by the antagonist. This happens in The Shining in here. So I do laugh about that. Like, it's not worth it. Don't go try and save the person. You're fucked. But I like characters like this. Farnsworth's character he seems like just the small town guy. He seems simple, but he's actually smarter than that. He actually is a better detective. He has wisdom. And the way he actually finds these beats and investigates this to actually find out where Paul is really well done. And they had to make a lot of that shit up for the movie. It's not really in the book. There's another major change, too, in that Annie cuts off Paul's foot in the book. But Rob Reiner said that he thought that was just too much of a cost. Like, yeah, he gets away at the end. But to not have a foot, that's just too much of a cost. So instead they came up with the iconic scene where, she just like breaks his bones and I can't remember what it's called, but when she takes like the hammer and just smashes his ankles and stuff like that, which is just as effective because really if you think about if she took an axe down and cut his foot off and blood just like shot up or something, I don't know if it would work the same way. It's more scary that it's not gory. And I know that William Goldman, who wrote this, who Princess Bride, Marathon Man, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, this is one of the greatest writers of all time. He didn't like that Reiner did that, that he changed it. He actually wanted to do it because of that sequence. And then once he saw the movie, he was like, oh, I get what you were doing. And then James Caan called him a sick fuck, which is funny to think about. It's just a meeting of so many things that you have this brilliant screenwriter adapting a really good book by Stephen King that has a lot of personal stuff in it. And then you get these two actors who really can elevate the material. And then Rob Reiner, where he's at as a director, because he said he related to it as this challenge that, this writer, Paul, is trying to do something out of his wheelhouse. And Rob Reiner felt that way after he got done with All in the Family, that he was pigeonholed as a meathead and doing this kind of stuff. And he wanted to make more serious films and different kinds of films. So it's all that stuff. Everyone here, like, they had something to prove, it feels like. Like, Kathy Bates knew this was the role she needed to become a star. The movie made $60 million, and she's had a huge career after this. James Caan, this was like his big return. Reiner got taken more seriously as a filmmaker, not just this really competent comedy filmmaker. So it's just all that stuff that makes this film just on a higher level than your typical horror film. Really, when you go back and watch this film, there's so many cliches in it that you can associate with it that got ripped off by every thriller that came out after this movie. Especially the character, you think they're dead and then they come back again. I know that happened with Mike Myers and stuff, but a real person, the fake out. And they feel less cliche when you go back and watch Misery. I expected it when I first saw it to be a little dated because it was from the early 90s and it was just so famous, but I thought, okay, this has to be a product of its time. I first saw it when I was a teenager. I remember I got Jack in the Box that day, and I was eating a teriyaki chicken bowl. And I was like, I'm going to watch Misery. And I was just blown away by it. It subtly builds tension. It's got great dialogue. There's just hilarious, well-done dialogue. There's these moments, he has these sleeping pills, and she's been giving to him, and then he puts them all in a wine glass with her while they're having a dinner because she's in love with him and she's being very overt about this and sexual because her husband left her and she finds connection in his novels and he's flirting with her back, trying to manipulate her, and he works so hard to try to knock her out with this wine, and then it just spills everywhere and you just see this defeat on his face. And there's scenes like that that really have an impact where it's like, yeah, there was no stabbing there, the music wasn't too dramatic, it was just this guy was, he's smart, he's smarter than her, so he's trying to outwit her. And then it just happenstance, it happens to get fucked up and he doesn't get to execute his plan. And then, you think he's going to get saved by Buster, and then that blows up in his face. And then it just goes into a full-on brawl at the end. This is how screwed up this movie is. She burns the book that he went out to write, that he's been working on, and he kills Misery, and she's so mad about this that she makes him write a new novel where he has to bring Misery back. So he's forced to write a new book, and she makes him burn this thing that he's worked like a long time on. So like, just that point of view, and you're crippled during all of this, and she says, I didn't call your family. Nobody knows where you are. You're trapped here, and I'm gonna kill myself, and I'm gonna kill you. That's just so horrifying. I can't think of many scenarios as scary as that. Like, that's so screwed up. And the reason I wanted to talk about this film, because I've been covering horror stuff this month, and I was thinking about all sorts of movies I could talk about. Really wanted to talk about Misery because it's special. Because the world we live in today, now that fans are so close with the artist, that we have stuff like Twitter, and there's all this talk about, toxic fandom and all that. And even though I don't buy into all that bullshit, it seems like more than ever the audience is part of the material and the audience influences the material. I mean, is there any YouTuber that isn't having a direct connection with their audience when they make their content? And that's what this movie really captures. And I think King was onto something that he didn't even realize that it would last so long, that thing, and become more relevant. That, how much does the audience have ownership of the art, and how much does the artist have ownership of it, which was really debated. Some people think once you put the art out there, it belongs to them and not to you. And I think that's a fair assessment, really, because people are going to interpret it differently than you. And if everyone doesn't feel the way you want them to, you can't blame them, because it was your job to execute it in a way where people can understand it. You were the one that was supposed to bring clarity to it. It's a mature film. It's comedic in the right ways, and it just has a tone and an atmosphere and a pace to it and an energy that just really, really works. It's a classic. This is an actual classic, not a movie that you're like, oh yeah, Misery, that's great. Like, no, this is a classic that this holds up, and it's going to hold up as time goes on. And yeah, it's just something with Kathy Bates' crazy face and the way she says these lines, and just how, weird she is. It's just a weird character. And she really just embraces the weird. And she's done this throughout her whole career. She does a lot of weird performances. And James Caan just being the straight man. I think some other actors could have done just as good of a job as James Caan, but it is nice to see him in this, because you're not so much thinking of like, holy shit, that's Dustin Hoffman. It's just like you see him as Paul, even though James Caan is as iconic as, many famous actors. I mean, he was in The Godfather, but you look at him and you're like, okay, yeah, I can buy him as this guy. He looks like the guy. He looks like what this guy should look like. And just little writing things I like, that he tries to send her away. So he's like, well, I have to write in a certain kind of paper. So he sends her away to do that. And then that ties into Buster finding her. This is just very good writing and clever stuff that Rob Reiner had to figure out to have this movie make sense. And to give it a little bit more, instead of it just being a two-person film, which for the most part it is. And then, yeah, at the end, Paul is able to move on and write stuff that he wants to. He has an image for a moment that he thinks he sees Annie. She's always there. The fan is always there. It's always in your soul. They're always trying to control your work. But then he comes back to reality, and he's like, no, it's okay. She's gone, and I can live my life now. And there's something really freeing about that. You end up feeling so bad for this guy, even though he is sort of an asshole. He's not like the most charismatic, likable guy. But by the end, yeah, you feel good that he got out of this situation because of what he had to go through. And that's what a good movie like this does. And it is worthy of a great Hitchcock film, which I don't say lightly. And it is worthy of several classics. I mean, it's more than a horror film. It really transcends that and becomes something deeper because of its thematic depth. And if you haven't seen it, which you probably have, I highly recommend it. It was nominated for one Oscar, and it won for Kathy Bates, although I think it should have been nominated for cinematography and a couple other awards. It's a very just terrific picture all around, and very well made. And I think about it sometimes. It's one of those movies I'm just like at work, or I'm at home, or I'm making food even, and I think about Misery. I think about her monologues and how she talks and stuff, and I think, I'm like, huh, it's one of those things that stays in your mind years after you see it. You only really need to see it once. You remember every scene so vividly. And I would use this as an example to any filmmakers out there who are trying to figure out how to make a movie. This was a $20 million movie, but it's a different time. Like, how do I make a film that gets attention? How do I make a big film? It doesn't have to be this big cinematic showcase. It doesn't have to be something with an ensemble. You don't have to use a lot of fancy editing and camera work and all that. It really is like, if you have a compelling story with a compelling theme that runs throughout it, that keeps the audience engaged, that thematic element, where they're not only, their eyes are focused on the material, but their brain is thinking about what's happening with the material. That's how you can really get traction with something. And Misery really is a good example of that. And it's saying something about the suffering of the artist for the benefit of the fans, and how the fans just take that for granted, that you're pouring your soul into this stuff, and then they feel like, because they think it means as much to them, and they're like, well, I own it too, it's mine. And we have to make that, we have to differentiate that stuff, that like, no, you didn't create this thing, it's not yours. You bought it, you own it, you have a right to feel what you want about it, you can criticize it, but it doesn't belong to you. Even if you wanted to, it doesn't wholly belong to you. Like I said, it's like, it's their children. And you don't just take someone's kid and say, well, this is my kid now. So it's all those elements together. I really love this movie, and I think it's arguably Rob Reiner's most impressive work, just as a technical filmmaker. Even though it's not my favorite film of his by at all. I much prefer Stand By Me and Princess Bride to this movie. But this is like, it's impressive that he made this film and he pulled it off. And I'd recommend the commentary track, even though it has those long pauses where he doesn't talk. It's an older commentary track where sometimes he's just watching the movie and you're like, can you fucking say something? But it is very insightful to his approach in the filmmaking and what he was thinking when he made it. And a lot of the things I was saying here came from that commentary track. Funny, weird, exciting, and deep. At the end of the day, this is a very deep film, which works as mainstream entertainment, but it is essentially as deep as a lot of art films or foreign films that you would be attracted to, and it's special in that way. So Misery, awesome movie, awesome Halloween watch, and one that you wouldn't initially go to when you're thinking about a Halloween movie, but it really is like one of the great horror films. I mean, I guess Silence of the Lambs coming out the year after this took a lot of the steam away from this, but I actually think Misery did a good job of setting this up. And you think about how even the slasher film was dead in the 90s before Scream came out, but it's easy to look at this with slasher elements. So I still think in some weird way this is an underappreciated film. Like, it doesn't get enough credit for what it did.
Misery, misery, misery. That's what you've chosen.